Hi everyone, welcome to another of my little video, teachings or thoughts, musings. Today I really wanted to talk about another subject which I guess I've been learning about so much in the last few years that I've often thought of maybe writing a book on it or sharing it in words somehow, but life just happens so quickly that this is a really great format for me to just give a snapshot of some of the things that I've been learning, which I really hope would help other people out there. We're all being helped so much by each other's stories. To me, that's the essence of peer support and why I love working in this field as well, in the field of mental health, as well as still experiencing my own recovery in it. I've actually just spent a week in hospital again. many times I've gone into hospital, and I guess I've kind of refined the process now of using it as a space to reflect and integrate. Now, I use that word integrate so many times when I speak about recovery, and often people ask me, what do you mean by integrate? So that's what today's video is about. It's about fragmentation of the self. So this idea that we have multiple aspects of ourselves which can be very fragmented, separated, dissociated from each other. And then the goal of recovery or healing would be to bring those parts together into a unified whole. Now this, framework to understand how this framework for understanding mental health often is associated with a few diagnoses. One is Dissociative Identity Disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. And I received that diagnosis myself a couple of years back. Prior to that, I had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and I would suggest that any of the trauma-based disorders might find this useful. Anyone who, I don't want to suggest that you have to have a diagnosis to watch this video. It's really not a language that I like to use, but I'm using it to make sure that people who've recently received that diagnosis will also come to this video, will be attracted to it, because diagnoses are very subjective. I've had about 5 or 6 over the last 7 years that I've been in the mental health system, and I think that reflects how subjective they are and how fluid they are as well, because I wouldn't say that there was an error necessarily in those diagnoses, but that they're a signpost, and I know I've talked about this before, a signpost to lead you to perhaps what might help. So the dissociative disorders, meaning those disorders where parts of us feel dissociated, where we're not fully in tune with aspects of ourselves, are usually associated with trauma and childhood trauma. I have to use that term very broadly as well, because I know a lot of people who have the dissociative identity disorder diagnosis, that's a mouthful, have unfortunately acquired that disorder or coping strategy, that's how their mind has dealt with the trauma. They've come from backgrounds of severe ritual abuse. There's a strong correlation there, which I don't know too much about, I have to say straight up, because that wasn't my experience. I guess when I had my DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder diagnosis, I was very low on the spectrum, if you like. If there's a spectrum, on the far end you've got people who dissociate completely from aspects of themselves to the point where they are not even aware that those aspects exist. They have a lot of memory lapses, loss of time, amnesia, and marked differences between not only the behavior of those aspects but also the neurological makeup of those aspects. So in extreme cases, different alters or parts will have different eyesight, will have different cholesterol levels, different handwriting, many different, physiological features, I should say. Not neurological, but both, all. It's all holistic. It's all happening on physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual planes. So that's at the far end, and then further down the spectrum, I guess you've got where I fit in, which you could have called it borderline personality disorder or DID. It was basically a fragmentation of self, and I also had a diagnosis of schizophrenia earlier on, which was another way of describing this fragmentation of self, because I've heard voices for much of my life, and these voices have been the dissociated parts. So first of all, this word dissociation, I just want to explain what that means, at least my understanding of it. To me, it's another word for fragmentation, and I think that's an easier word for people to grasp, because we all know what fragmentation is. It's fragments, so it's something that was once whole has been fragmented and split into parts. So dissociation means that rather than associating ourselves with those parts and looking at them, being able to kind of look at those parts and go, yeah, that's me and that's me and that's me, dissociation is where we disown that energy, we disown that aspect of ourselves. And this isn't like necessarily a mental illness feature. It's something that every human being does as part of the psychological defense mechanisms to cope with this crazy world that we're living in. So, how it develops in childhood for every human being is that, parts of us are, we're taught by our caregivers that parts of us are okay and parts of us are not okay. So, in an ideal parenting situation, this would translate as certain behaviours are okay and certain behaviours are not okay. But actually, because of the style of parenting and the level of transgenerational trauma that has been experienced on this planet collectively as humanity, is such that many parents themselves have passed on a message of not just that the behaviour is not okay, but the part of you displaying that behaviour is not okay. So some aspect of you is flawed and bad. And this internalization, this taking on the belief that you are bad or a part of you is bad, is what leads to repression of that stuff. So, for many of us, it's around getting our needs met and being able to express our feelings. So maybe we were taught that was bad. It was not okay to ask for what we needed, and it wasn't okay to express negative feelings. Usually that's the case, although I do know, I've met some people who are dissociated from their positive aspects. So it's really common to be dissociated from the negative ones, like anger or hurt, shame, guilt, those sorts of emotions. But equally, we can repress the happy, joyous parts of ourselves, maybe because that was also not okay in the home that we grew up. I worked with one beautiful being at one point in my work as a mental health worker, who heard voices that were always telling him to not to be too big, not to be too loud, not to be joyous. They were kind of pulling him down and making him a very rigid, restricted, isolated, reserved sort of a person. And when we explored his childhood, he revealed that the message his parents gave him was not to be too big for your britches, which is an old saying. It's like, the way he described it was when he got excited or ran around the house or wanted to do something childish like climb a tree, they would repress that and tell him to shh all the time, or when he tried to, I guess, grow into his own individual little adult self, as children do naturally, that was him being too big for his britches. So he repressed the joyful, exploring, playful, childlike part of himself. And then as an adult, that was the work that he was doing, was to bring that aspect back. to bring it back online, because it's all about balance, balancing out. Well, first it's about balance, I have to say. There's so many stages to this healing gig. And these videos will be impossibly long if I try to explain each of them, but balance is important. It's part of a stage where, we come to understand that we are fragmented and that we've dissociated parts of ourselves. And then we start to realize where we're out of balance. So maybe we're too much of a perfectionist, and the people-pleasing, rigid, rule-making, critical part of ourselves has really got control of the personality, and isn't allowing the parts that have less of a voice to come out. And those parts might be the parts that dream, or the parts that want to travel, or the parts that want to make art, or and so it goes. So this exploration of the personality and understanding it in terms of many selves is so relevant for everybody. I think it's really useful work for anyone to do. And there's a lot of pioneers and thinkers in this space. I'll try and put a couple of references in the links below of some frameworks that you can go and have a look at. There's the internal family systems, the psychology of the selves by Helen Sidra Stone. There's a number of others. I'm probably missing a few out, but a lot of work has been done in this space, looking, in mental health through the diagnosis of borderline and dissociative identity disorder as ways to heal these fragmented selves. Schema therapy is another one, which works with different parts. So today I thought what I might do is I might share with you a few pictures that I've drawn to depict the different aspects of self, just as a means to show you, I guess like it's a powerful medium, sometimes imagery more so than my words, to show you the journey, because that's the point of this video, is to try to show you the journey of healing in a very short time. So we'll give it a go. So this first drawing that I'm showing you here is one that I drew very early on in my breakdown. I guess I had like a pretty major breakdown in 2010, where I had to learn to work with all of this stuff. I was kind of forced into it because I was so debilitated. So this drawing was a recognition of inner parts, and this is way before I'd even heard of these diagnoses. It was just an intuitive drawing that came out, and you can see there the little Russian dolls, babushka dolls, how they all nest inside one another. And the first one there is, as you can see, like a smiling, happy one, and that was depicting the facade, the self that we present to the world. And there was a few things there that she was carrying that were important to her. At the time I was a kickboxer. I was really loving my kickboxing, and I loved writing, and I was also, it wasn't so much religious, it was that just the cross just depicted my spiritual practice, my personal spiritual practice. And then the next one down was depicting more of the teenager self. So this is also chronological, it goes back in time, and that's what happens with the selves, is that they tend to, I guess, become like a form. They sort of manifest as a form at critical times of trauma, or when things were very distressing for us. So this teenager self here is depicting those awful teenage years, which I know for so many of us were traumatic. The cracks there are, the description of the neurotic, tense personality that I felt I was underneath it all. The glasses, which I wore up until I was about age 13, which, was the source of great shame and embarrassment at school. And the bleeding fingers were depicting the nervousness, which was coming out in nail biting. And then the next one down is the pain. Now that one is younger again, so we would be talking like sort of, I'm not really sure, maybe 6 or 7 or 8, something like that, holding the teddy bear there, distress, pain inside. not really expressed to my family. My family probably would look at this picture and not really relate to it, because these things are internal often, and that's the problem with dissociation, is that the aspects go underground in the psyche. They may not be visible, or they won't be. That's the point. I suppose if it becomes a disorder, they won't be visible to you. They'll be repressed in the unconscious, and that's where the healing of it is. Well, it's impossible really until you become aware, which is why I'm highlighting this step and I'm highlighting this drawing for you to show you, just the importance of this. Somehow, whether you write it out or you talk it out with a therapist or you draw it like I've done, you can do a mind map. That's another really great way of doing it. Just circles on a bit of paper, but whatever way you feel called, it's creating that awareness, because otherwise they stay hidden and we don't know about them, and if we don't know about them, we can't heal them. So it's as simple as that. So then the little angry part, that was depicting just the anger, which was, I guess, underneath the distress, the anger at not getting needs met. So when children try to control their environments and try to get their needs met, and then they get a no on some level, some sort of a rejection, this leaves a lot of residue of anger, because ultimately anger is the emotion that helps us get our needs met and helps us assert ourselves when we want something. And when we are frustrated about something, that's like a really natural human reaction to have. Now I know I don't know the source of this, but my psychologist many times has explained to me how experiments have shown, or observations rather, have been made on babies that are neglected emotionally, and they will go from initially, when they can't get their needs met, so let's say they're lying in a crib and they are hungry, initially they will they'll cry out, right? So they'll cry. Then when the need isn't met, they'll get angry. And then when the need isn't met, still hours later or however long, they'll fall into like a depression, apathy. They'll give up, which breaks your heart when you think of it, right? A little baby giving up like that. But this is what happens to so many of us. We end up giving up. And so that's how things get repressed. But that anger didn't just disappear. That anger was unprocessed and is held in the psyche. So this little babushka doll represents that anger and not getting needs met. Now the reason why the little doll is holding a knife and stabbing me is because there is actually another stage in there. There's anger at the not getting the need met. So anger at, well, in a little baby's mind, it's mum, dad, the world, I don't know, just anger. It's not got a rational reason at that age. But then at some point the child will turn the anger on themselves and blame themselves for not having the need met. So it becomes, well, if I'm not getting the need met, then I must be bad. This internal, really simplistic internal child logic operates. So that's why I was hurting myself in that little drawing. And then the next one down is the broken heart. So that's the sense of being abandoned. Abandonment, I think, is a core wound that most human beings on this planet are carrying. There's some also really interesting work done by Mark Passio, who speaks about it's a whole tangential subject on natural law and why the world is such a mess. Again, I'll try and put the link down below, and I'll just make a note now to do that for you guys. He talks about abandonment being our core wound, the thing that we have to heal. And interestingly, abandonment is also it's a separation, really. To be abandoned is to be separated. And we have been abandoned, parts of us will have been abandoned by our parents, no doubt, because, with the state of humanity the way it is, parents haven't been capable of loving the whole. Like, we haven't had collective consciousness on our planet that's enabled human beings to actually love without condition. And loving without condition, unconditional love, is what we experience prior to this incarnation. So it's the love of the fifth and higher dimensions. The dimensional aspects to all of this is hopefully something I'll talk more and more about. It's extremely complex, and if you're new to the subject, then it might be a bit overwhelming, so I won't go into it too much today. But the idea is that prior to our incarnation, we are connected to source, if that feels like a good word for you. I personally like that word. It's where we've come from, and in that place there is unconditional love. And so we arrive in this physical incarnation, and immediately there's a separation, and it's we feel it. We're very wounded by that. All of us are carrying that wound of separation and abandonment. That will be exemplified or exacerbated, I should say, if we have a family that can't hold space for the many aspects of ourselves, the perceived badness and goodness, because in a space of unconditional love there is no badness and no goodness, but children are judged, just as we all are in this physical world. At least in a third dimensional sense, we're judged. So that judgment, what is judgment but a decision about what is good and what is bad? And so we internalize that judgment, and then we take it out on ourselves. The idea of integration is to move from judgment of good and bad to a state of unconditional love for self, and that's the journey that this stuff actually allows us to go on. Now, I did depict, in a way, the unconditional love condition in this drawing, the little tiny little yellow doll at the very end, which is the core essence, the essence of light and love, which we are. The I am, the divine consciousness, which is merely cloaked, I suppose, by our trauma experiences, our body, our physical, emotional, mental bodies, cover up that beautiful essence that we each are. Healing from mental distress is a spiritual journey, and even if you don't identify as being part of a spiritual community or having a spiritual practice, the ultimate healing requires us to go into the deepest of places, and when we go into the deepest of places, we will meet our spirituality. Spirituality, if you want to break it down, the word spirit meaning non-physical, so the non-physical. So you can describe this in so many ways. Traditionally you might speak of it as God, or use more of a religious-based language. There's now a lot more options when we speak of spirituality, and we can speak of it as such, like the universe, we might say. We could call it that which is. We could call it source. We could call it divine presence, the I am presence. There's many, many ways, and please don't be frightened of including spirituality as part of your healing framework, because actually it's one of the most associated parts of our Western culture. We've actually disowned our spirituality, and in a lot of ways that's hugely understandable because of the damage that religion has done, religious doctrine has done, to take away our sense of sovereignty and mastery, and giving us a message that we're sinful and wrong to be in this body, that we are. I wonder if you can see the correlation there between the paternal God figure that judges us as right and wrong, and the same messages that we might have got from our parents. So expanding our view can be really helpful, give us a bigger and bigger context of why we are the way we are, why each of us is this way, why we all have this healing work to do. because I think sometimes, we have fragmented our society so much to the point where when people have these experiences, they think I'm a freak. What's wrong with me? And then of course you walk into a hospital and you get a mental illness diagnosis, and you look around and you think everybody else is coping, but are they really coping? We all have this work to do. This is the integration of the shadow work. Now the shadow might be this drawing that I've shown to you is a way of depicting the shadow. These were the aspects of myself that had been repressed and were literally in the shadow. So in the shadow, whatever's in the shadow is that which we do not want to see, that which others have not wanted us to see, or society doesn't want us to see. So working with the shadow is, it's essential, I believe. I have to say I believe, because I'm not ever going to tell another person, another being, what's right for them, what you have to do. So I will say I believe for all beings who want to be healed from trauma, working with the shadow is essential. And then I will also say that I know for myself that working with the shadow has been essential for my healing of trauma. So that is a knowing that comes from within. There's a bit of a distinction there. So I wanted to show you that, and there's another picture that I'll show you, which is this one. So as I mentioned before, we've got becoming aware of the fragmentation is the first thing. So the process for me, I started to become aware of the parts when I started to engage with mental health services in a really serious way. So in other words, I was in a hospital, and I started to have a clinical team around me, and all of a sudden I was developing these really strong attachments to people, my doctor and my psychologist, and because my defenses had become so broken down, the dissolution of the ego being that protective facade that we can kind of walk around with, had disintegrated. For me, I didn't have that anymore. So the little parts that I'm depicting in this drawing for you here were out and about. So they were really making themselves known. And I've got to say, initially it was so painful to go through, I suppose to go through this awakening process, to become aware of these little parts, because they're little, like, here I was trying to be I don't know, whatever age I was then, 38-year-old adult, and suddenly, I was rocking myself in a corner, and, couldn't look anybody in the eye, felt like a 5-year-old, felt 5-year-old consciousness, and with all the overwhelm that comes with that. So these little characters all depicting different aspects. I'll just sort of read through some of them, I guess. There's me on the far left, and then there's a little angry girl saying I'm bad and messy and needy and noisy. Then we've got a sort of serious looking, neat little girl saying I must be perfect, everything's fine. There's another part, the perfectionist part. A little boy, so sometimes, or many people with DID who will name and be aware of aspects of self to the extent where they may have, like I said, a name, they might have a different gender, they might like different clothes, they might have different taste in music, they can be quite different to the main personality. So this one was a little boy, and his energy was, I hate everyone, no one can be trusted. He was carrying a lot of the anger. I suppose little boys are pretty destructive and angry sometimes. Then we have a very sad looking little girl there saying, I'm so ashamed, I'm bad. And then a couple of other little girls holding the hand of my doctor. So this one is saying, I feel cared for, and the smaller one is saying, please don't leave me. Now, I remember for at least, I don't know, 2 or 3 years of right in the thick of all this, when all of this was coming out and the parts were coming out in drawings and writings and, you know, and my behavior, and I was dissociating a lot. So I would go from being in an adult state in control, something would trigger me and I would switch, as it's sometimes called in DID language, into these very regressed states. Regressed, again, that's the language that the hospital would have used for me, writing it in my file. But it was a regression in time. It was a regression to an earlier age, so I guess that language makes sense. And it was painfully embarrassing. That's the first thing. You know, this exploring the stuff is really, really difficult, because the parts were parts in the first place, so they were aspects of self that was dissociated literally because they had not been accepted when I was a child. So you know, what had happened was my adult self didn't want them either. They were very unwanted, these little parts. And you know, as I showed my neediness, which is kind of like, it was like 5-year-old neediness frozen in time, you know, so it had been there all along. It was just waiting for the right person to kind of activate it and trigger it. And that's what happens with the shadow. It will always get activated. You know, some people's shadow, maybe they don't associate it with children or inner children or younger parts. There'll always be that stuff there for sure, but it may not be the healing journey for some. Some will just say things like, you know, I have this angry monster inside of me, and when I get, I don't know, triggered by drinking, you know, this anger comes out. So the Jekyll and Hyde type of thing. There are a lot of different ways of explaining it, and each of us have to find our own language. But yeah, for me, these parts would get triggered. I would switch into the state, and I would do things that would be just excruciatingly embarrassing. Like, you know, hiding. I did a lot of hiding. I would hide in cupboards, under beds. I would not be able to speak, so I would become mute. And you know, I didn't like the sound of my voice when I was in those states. I thought my voice sounded really whiny and pathetic, and you know, that judgment, whiny and pathetic, that's coming from that original trauma, that was not okay behavior. So I've internalized a judgment about that behavior. So yeah, I mean, this stuff is big, guys. It's like we are literally, one of the gifts, I guess, of all this material is that DID allows you to actually see, like lays it all out, all of the things you didn't want to look at. Maybe you spent, like me, 36 years of your life just running away from it, and then all of a sudden it gets so bad, we get backed into a corner, we have to look at the stuff. So yeah, now I've talked a lot about the fragmentation. I think what I'm going to do, because I haven't got very far into what I wanted to share with you guys, I'm going to have to do this in parts. So I'll do this as part 1, talking about, this is the awareness, becoming aware of fragmented parts and aspects of self. And then I'll come back soon and I'll talk about how to, practical ways to work with these parts. And then hopefully we'll either get to the end of part 2 or maybe the end of part 3, and I can wrap it up with talking about integration, which is where I'm trying to go with all of this for you. So you can see the whole arc, and, you know, encouragement to really just hang in there, because I know how painful this stuff is, but it's also so liberating and healing and self-empowering. You know, this is not healing in the form of a tablet or healing in the form of I don't know what else. A lot of management of mental illness these days will just be about pasting over and band-aiding things, you know, but I don't accept that. I think if we really want to heal, then the opportunities are there. It just requires a lot of work and, yeah, going within and really exploring all of this stuff, your shadow, becoming friends with your shadow. So so I hope you'll join me for the next part. I will be back really soon to share it with you, and lots of love to you all, and may all beings be free and find peace.